A day rarely passes when we aren't exposed to some kind of news about the global West's mounting tensions with China. Most of these stories are concerned with a potential geopolitical crisis, particularly related to a military conflict arising from China's contentious relationship with its neighboring nations. However, what if I were to tell you that beyond a direct military conflict, a geopolitical flashpoint with China would reach much further than many realize? Indeed, as we speak, China possesses the ability to potentially cripple Western militaries without firing a single shot. The Chinese government could rapidly reach out and touch millions of citizens living in the West without a single soldier leaving the country's borders, giving rise to a public health catastrophe on a scale rarely observed in modern history. This situation is the product of a carefully orchestrated plan to gain control of the global pharmaceutical market. It's a campaign that has experienced incredible success, threatening life as we know it in the West and granting China a frightening amount of leverage if a geopolitical crisis were to emerge. Now, many of us take medications daily for a variety of conditions: high blood pressure, anxiety, depression, cancer treatment, birth control. In fact, studies indicate that over a third of adults in the United States and Europe take medications daily. What many of these individuals are unaware of is that the production and availability of many medications is highly dependent on imports from China. If the Chinese government were to cut off the supply of these products, experts estimate that domestic stocks of these supplies could disappear within 2 months, with no plan currently in place to compensate for their loss. So in this episode of Into the Shadows, we're going to examine the situation in detail. How did the West become so reliant on China for these pharmaceutical products in the first place? How bad would it be if China decided to restrict access to pharmaceutical products to the West? And finally, what, if anything, could be done to mitigate this looming crisis that is poised to affect millions? All right, let's begin by discussing the pharmaceutical manufacturing process, a topic that is unsurprisingly complicated. Pharmaceutical manufacturers have developed a highly efficient pipeline for manufacturing these goods. The process begins with raw products that are processed to generate intended biologically active molecules, also known as the active ingredients in drugs. These active ingredients are then packaged into the final drug products that we can find on pharmacy shelves. It's not uncommon for a different company to be responsible for each step in the full manufacturing process. Now, until the early 2000s, China was not a major provider of pharmaceuticals to the global market. In fact, 90% of the world's active ingredients were manufactured in the US or Europe, with China's drug production primarily focusing on fulfilling the needs of its own rapidly growing population. At this time, a large portion of the West's pharmaceutical manufacturing capabilities were occupied with the production of simple and generic drugs, cheap products with razor-thin profit margins. However, the entire drug manufacturing landscape changed as China continued exploiting its lack of workplace regulations and environmental oversight to become the manufacturing powerhouse of the world. In China, labor was cheap, the toxic byproducts generated during pharmaceutical manufacturing didn't really matter, and Western companies were eager to do business. This business decision increased the profitability of the Western companies' generic products and freed up their domestic manufacturing bandwidth for more profitable and patented drugs. After the process of pharmaceutical outsourcing began, the Chinese government started finding ways to promote it. In 2005, the Chinese government passed measures that enabled rapid approval of pharmaceutical production facilities. Over time, China exploited its economic advantages to become quietly responsible for producing about 40% of the world's active pharmaceutical ingredients. Now, only a few companies are in total control of every step involved in the production of each drug. It's very difficult to say exactly how reliant the global West is on China for pharmaceuticals, and that's largely because regulatory agencies in the US and Europe don't collect statistics on the individual contributions of the supply chains underlying imported pharmaceutical products. The United States Food and Drug Administration did release a report in 2019 in which it investigated the geographical distribution of active ingredient manufacturers. Unfortunately, the report did little to identify the US's dependence on Chinese pharmaceuticals because it did not evaluate the quantity of active ingredients produced at each location. However, this missing data didn't prevent the report from going viral due to an erroneously interpreted statistic that stated that 80% of the US drug supply is dependent on China. But the truth is perhaps even more unnerving than that. We don't know how much of the US drug supply is dependent on China. Despite the unclear nature of the West's pharmaceutical supply chains, there are some inferences that we can make to get a better view of the situation. We know that in 2023, fewer than 5 manufacturing sites in China produced over 50% of the active pharmaceutical ingredients that Europe depended on for its generic drug supply. This led representatives from multiple EU nations to formally voice concern and demands that action be taken within the European Commission. Additionally, we know that US investment in China-sourced pharmaceuticals experienced an approximate 70-fold increase from 2005 to 2021. A supply chain review from the White House acknowledged that there is great risk in over-reliance on a foreign government for pharmaceutical supplies, and that American citizens are currently vulnerable to the geopolitical strategies of foreign governments. If China cut off their supplies of pharmaceutical products to the West, it wouldn't just impact millions of citizens, it would also affect these nations' militaries. In 2023, the US Department of Defense determined that 54% of its pharmaceutical supplies originated from unreliable sources, including China. A military conflict could rapidly create a demand for pharmaceuticals so high that it would collapse these fragile supply chains. Finally, but importantly, the Chinese government appears to acknowledge the power that China holds in the global drug market. Editorials encouraging the government to leverage this power are common in state-sponsored media. A prominent economics professor even suggested blocking all pharmaceutical exports to the United States in response to the ongoing trade war between the two nations in 2020. China's role in generic drug production is the primary source of its current leverage over the global pharmaceutical market. While it is true that generic drugs are not very profitable, they play an irreplaceable and outsized role in public health. Generic drugs make up 90% of prescriptions in the US in 2022, up from 50% in 2005. Studies also suggest that generic medications can fulfill about 80% of medical needs in Europe. In other words, these are the drugs that keep countless chronic health conditions under control and provide life-saving treatments for millions every single day. The possibility of losing them is absolutely terrifying. Some analysts suggest that India could serve as a buffer to the West's dependence on China. However, there's an underlying flaw to that logic. It is true that India has made their name as the world's largest source of generic medication, accounting for 20% of the global supply by volume. However, to make a profit on cheap generic drugs, Indian companies must obtain their ingredients from China. Similar to Western companies, India outsources the production of 90% of its active ingredients for generic pharmaceuticals to China to increase profit margins on its products. One of the greatest advantages for the West is the continued control of profitable and patented pharmaceuticals. These are drugs that are frequently used to treat complex and rare conditions. With the increased life expectancy in China, the prevalence of these types of diseases has also increased. Cancer cases in China increased by 55% between 2002 and 2016. Due to a shortage of appropriate medications, cancer survivorship in China is less than half of that of the US and Europe. To obtain as many of these drugs as possible, the Chinese government reduced the import tariff of these products to 0% in 2018. China is working to address the ongoing shortage of more complex medicines. They recently began taking steps to overhaul their pharmaceutical industry to be better poised to make more profitable and advanced pharmaceutical products. In 2016, China's FDA changed its drug quality standards to encourage domestic production of drugs comparable to those that they currently import. Additionally, China introduced new stringent environmental and pollution regulations in 2017, resulting in the closure of over 70,000 pharmaceutical manufacturing facilities and further refining the quality of its domestic production pipeline. In 2022, China controlled about 10% of the market share for patented active pharmaceutical ingredients, and it has continued to bring new products to market since then. China's role in the global pharmaceutical industry, combined with its mounting tension with the West, makes this whole situation look rather grim. Now, we'll look at what efforts are being undertaken to address this precarious situation and what actions are still to be taken in the future. First, India has set its sights on procuring some of China's pharmaceutical market share. In 2020, the Indian government unveiled a plan to promote increased domestic production of pharmaceutical ingredients. This plan sets aside $900 million to incentivize manufacturers to make high-priority pharmaceutical products that are currently imported from China. This plan's not perfect, however. The government's list of high-priority pharmaceuticals is lacking some active ingredients that might never be profitable for India to produce, but also play an important role in the global drug market. However, this plan should still work in favor of Western nations, given the less adversarial relationship between the global West and India compared to China. Europe has been a leader in seeking options to address its dependence on Chinese pharmaceuticals. Austria's government recently committed €50 million, about $54 billion, to maintaining antibiotic manufacturing facilities in the country, despite their unprofitable nature. France similarly elected to re-establish domestic generic painkiller production for the first time since 2008. The European Commission has also proposed creating an official list of particularly high-priority medications. The supply chains of these medications would be closely monitored, with an emphasis on diversifying sources of these drugs if possible. Finally, some members of the EU have proposed legislation that would require insurance companies to favor reimbursements of European-produced medications over those that are imported. The most concrete mitigation step in the US came in 2020, when California Governor Gavin Newsom signed into law a plan to manufacture affordable generic drugs in his state. The plan prioritizes the production of insulin and medications that treat high-cost chronic conditions. This is slated to begin with a contract authorizing affordable insulin production this year. Other US plans have been less concrete. One recent analysis suggested several steps, including increasing tariffs on Chinese-sourced drugs and incentivizing other emerging economies like Vietnam, Malaysia, or Thailand to produce these pharmaceutical ingredients. Another analysis suggested establishing an 18-month domestic stockpile of pharmaceutical ingredients. These basic pharmaceutical ingredients would have a 3 to 4 times longer shelf life than the finished drug products. Additionally, a small number of basic pharmaceutical ingredients can be synthesized into a broad spectrum of final drug products. The 18-month stock would then give the US time to establish other sources of pharmaceutical products in the event of a geopolitical crisis. Others have expressed a need to eliminate as many of the middlemen in the supply chain as possible to reduce costs of domestically produced drugs and undercut the Chinese products. However, this would require increased domestic drug production, which is another problem. Many drug production facilities in both Europe and the US have closed throughout the process of pharmaceutical outsourcing. The remaining manufacturing facilities are operating at an average of 50% production capacity. It would take time and significant investment to ramp up production and restore domestic manufacturing of drugs that have been discontinued. Furthermore, pharmaceutical manufacturing within the borders of a nation alone might not be the remedy that it initially appears to be. One pharmaceutical manufacturing company, Wuxi AppTec, is producing cutting-edge drugs in the US states of Massachusetts and Delaware. However, it's likely Wuxi AppTec has strong ties to the Chinese government. The company has recently come under scrutiny by politicians seeking to limit business opportunities of Chinese-owned companies in the United States. So not even domestic drug production is always domestic drug production, which further contributes to the nightmare of regulating these supply chains. Regardless of what steps are ultimately taken by Western nations, one thing is very important to accept. Generic drugs produced outside of China and India are likely to be 30 to 80% more expensive than the drugs that Western nations are currently importing. And this begs the question, are the citizens of these nations willing to pay a higher price in exchange for a more reliable supply? Analysis suggests that the answer is likely yes. In addition to a more reliable supply chain, citizens would enjoy increased confidence in the quality of these products. Contamination of Chinese-produced drugs has been a potential risk associated with China's efficient cost-cutting procedures. In 2008, shipments of contaminated Chinese-produced blood thinner led to the deaths of 81 Americans. 10 years later, a known carcinogen was detected within a generic blood pressure medication, leading to the medication's recall in the EU. These cases of contamination avoid detection due to the very same policies that make these Chinese-produced drugs so affordable. If these drugs were produced in nations with higher quality standards, these cases would be much less likely to occur. And there's a lot to be said for that. Many potential sources to the West's reliance on Chinese pharmaceuticals have been floated, but there doesn't seem to be a lot of action. This lack of action can be blamed on a variety of factors. Within the US, the topic has fallen victim to partisan politics, where loyalty to political parties can matter more than the underlying data. However, these data are undeniable. Despite the difficulty in accurately quantifying exactly how dependent the West is on pharmaceuticals from China, we can feel confident saying that the reliance is stronger than it should be. To avoid a situation that is at best uncomfortable and at worst catastrophic, action should be taken now. Correcting the problem will not happen quickly, it will not be cheap, and it will not be easy. However, when we consider everything that is at risk, it might just be worth the necessary time, money, and effort.